Hello everyone, this is John Mark Johnson Jr. again, host of Reformed GGA, and I'm here today to talk a little bit about the history and utility, or not, of pistol caliber carbines. Our example today is a Strebog SP9A1, and yes, I'm aware of the fact that legally speaking this is still considered a pistol, not technically a carbine. But in kind of the historical sense that carbines were supposed to fill, it does have that general feel. It's something that fires a pistol round, but it does it in a very rifle-like way, is basically what a pistol caliber carbine is, the idea behind it. And so while this might not legally technically be a carbine, it still has a pistol caliber carbine type of vibe. And frankly, in most other places in the world, they would consider it a pistol caliber carbine. Here in the US, we have strange laws that require strange things. And so because of the barrel length on this gun, I'm not legally allowed to have a proper stock. This is a brace, not a stock, and this is what I can legally put on this gun. I cannot put a proper stock on it, just a brace. But before we go any further, we'll go ahead and we'll check and make sure that the weapon is clear before handling it. So as you can see, there's no magazine in the magwell. I can feel that there's no magazine in the magwell. Go ahead and open up the chamber. I can see that there is no round in the chamber. I can feel that there is no round in the chamber. This gun is safe. Alright, so now that we've got that out of the way and we have something to look at while we're talking about this, let's talk about the history of pistol caliber carbines a little bit, where the concept came from, and where kind of all this has been going and where this is wound up now. First of all, I'll just say that I find pistol caliber carbines very interesting and I like them a lot. I own multiple of them. Doesn't mean that I don't like other categories of guns either. I, for example, do in fact own an AR-15. Some people think that I don't like rifles. I'm just fine with them. It's just there are certain things about them that I don't like as much as these. I consider these to be much more fun. And as far as my situation and being someone who travels a lot, they also tend to be a little bit more practical. There are arguments that can be made for a properly configured, say, AR-15 or something like that, that could be suitably travelable as well. I'm not saying that they can't, but I think these ones are a little bit better. But obviously, I have a bias, and that's my main point that I'm trying to get across here. So when I talk about these things and advantages, disadvantages, yeah, it's going to come across that I have a little bit of a bias towards these things. But I still think there are some interesting things historically that have gone on that will be worth talking about, and I think a lot of people will benefit just from hearing, just in terms of thinking things through. So pistol caliber carbines, where did that concept develop? In some regards, you might be able to push it back to the days of black powder rifles, the old powder patch ball thing, in that some of the pistols of the time had the same diameter bore as some of the rifles of the time, which means that you could use the same projectile in either one. You'd usually, in the pistol version, you would have a little bit smaller propellant charge to make sure that it didn't kick as much so that you could actually handle it better, because pistol you wouldn't be shouldering or anything like that. You'd want something that's more controllable. But there were pistols at the time that had that were completely interchangeable, at least as far as the projectile was concerned, with the rifle. However, as firearms technology developed and we start getting to actual cartridges, like I have here, where you have the powder, the projectile, the primer, everything contained in one unit, you start seeing a lot more differentiation between the different weapons types. And rifle caliber guns start to develop in one way, pistol caliber guns start to develop in another way. And overall what you see is also a proliferation in the popularity and utility of the smaller guns. I mean, back in the days of black powder, the smaller guns really had some pretty severe limitations. You're talking about 1 or maybe 2 shots at most, and then after that you have to reload. And of course, since it was a handgun, the effective range on it usually wasn't very great. Most people can't shoot handguns very effectively at any considerable range, and that is a truth that has remained with us, as far as long as firearms have existed. And so in the days of black powder, The handgun was there, and it did have its uses and its purposes and some utility, but for any kind of serious use, the rifle really was the go-to. If you're going to have something that you can only fire one shot at a time with, and then you have to go through this whole reloading process, it makes sense to have something that you can get better range out of and fire more accurately at longer distances. That just makes sense. But as we get into the days of having true self-contained cartridges that are fairly reliable, we see handguns come on the scene in a very new and profound way, especially with the development of revolvers. Revolvers held a decent number of rounds in them that could be fired one after the other just simply by pulling the trigger, or with some of the early ones you'd have to thumb down the hammer and then pull the trigger, but not an overly complicated process, not nearly as hard as the old, powder patch ball thing, ramming it all down and all that. Not nearly as difficult as that at all. Much simpler process. And so you have something that has a decent amount of repeatability in it, fairly small, fairly compact, easy to carry, and what it really wound up doing was equalizing the playing field. As one person put it, I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but as one person put it, God made men all equal. And Mr. Colts, one of the designers of said revolvers, made sure that they stayed that way. And there's a lot of truth to that statement. Revolvers really put defensive firearm use in the forefront of people's minds and way of thinking about things. Since they were small, relatively compact, relatively easy to carry, you would get a lot of people who would be carrying these things around, and it really did equalize the playing field. Contrary to popular belief, the Old West, in which you see a lot of depictions of people carrying around firearms all the time, although this did happen in cities as well, but usually a little bit more famous in those kinds of scenarios. Contrary to popular opinion, the Wild West wasn't really all that wild in most cases. Yes, a lot of people did have weapons with them, and revolvers became very popular just because of the utility of having something that was easy to transport with you. Yes, that did happen, but in terms of people carrying these things around, but it didn't turn into the bloodbath that the movies would make it. It wasn't always shootouts at the OK Corral. Those kinds of incidents did happen, but they were very rare, actually. And so, as a whole, the proliferation of firearms, especially in the American West and places like that were relatively rural, tended to keep the violent crime rate down rather than up. Like I said, the things like shootouts and those kinds of things were definitely the exception. They were not the rule. It was not common in those situations for those kinds of things to happen at all. It was very rare that those things would. And that was because everybody was armed. If you started a fight, it was a real good chance that someone else was going to finish it for you. That's just the effect that things had. And so you see pistol caliber rounds becoming much more popular. It's the round that everybody's going to need because everybody has one of these kinds of guns with them. Everybody's got some kind of pistol now. It was very, 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 very common by comparison. Whereas handguns, usually very limited in scope, not overly useful, especially being single shot, and of course not overly accurate. I mean, back in the day, you would have people who would have pistol duels. Not rifle duels, pistol duels, because dueling with pistols was considered sporting. In other words, neither of us can hit the broadside of a barn with this, so if one of us happens to get the lucky shot on the other, that somehow proves something. But the reason why you had dueling pistols and those kinds of things even in the first place, pistol duels and those kinds of things in the first place, was because people knew that they weren't overly accurate with them, and there was major problems that way. The advent of the revolver, where you had multiple follow-up shots that you could do, really turned it into a much more viable system instead of, something, oh, I got a lucky shot on the guy, okay, great. Something that actually became viable as a defensive weapon. And so you get a lot of people carrying these things. You have a demand for ammunition for these things. It's what a lot of people have available to them. But occasionally, you would still have cases where you would need to take a longer shot and make it more accurate. The advantage of the revolver is that you had follow-up shots, which is nice, especially when you're dealing with human attackers. But there are certain situations where that's not going to help you that much. The revolver did not make the handgun any more innately accurate. Yes, you can get better rifling on them and those kinds of things that'll make it more accurate, but a handgun is still a handgun, and the effective range for the average person is still relatively limited with a handgun. Most people, in the past and present, really aren't overly great with handguns past 15 yards. Now with proper training and enough time put in on the weapon, and of course the money to train on the weapon, yeah, you can get past that, and there are people who have trained with their handguns who can go well past 15 yards. I'm not saying that it's impossible, but for the average person who is of moderate or low skill, 15 yards really is pushing it. And so, yeah, while having multiple rounds in the cylinder of your revolver can help you out if someone is attacking you and they keep coming at you and they're very close proximity, it doesn't help you out in certain other situations. So, for example, you might have cowboys out on the range, and yeah, a lot of times they would have a pistol with them, but sometimes when they're out there, they live off the land, and if you happen to see a deer over in the brush, it'd be really nice to be able to kill it and eat it and have some meat that night instead of just beans and whatever else you happen to have with you. It'd be nice to have some fresh meat, and that kind of thing would happen fairly often. But with handguns, not overly accurate. A lot of times, you shoot, it spooks the animal, you didn't hit it, it runs away into the night, and there goes your fresh meat dinner. And so people who are in this kind of a situation, who really wanted to be able to take some longer shots, really realized that being able to extend the range of the handgun ammunition would be really advantageous. They didn't necessarily need something overly powerful, just something that would be enough to get some fresh meat for that night. So it might be a small deer, it might be a rabbit, nothing necessarily huge, but just, enough to put a little meat on the table that night, some fresh meat on the table. And so the solution to that was basically the lever action gun. A lot of the lever action guns of the time, like the Winchesters and things like that, basically fired pistol caliber rounds. Same rounds that they would be using in the revolvers. All that it would do is give you an extra point of contact, a little bit of extra barrel length, and it would make that pistol caliber round a little bit more effective, especially in terms of range. Because like I said, the average person really can't hit much with a handgun past 15 yards. Put a rifle in their hands though, and a lot of them can get effective shots on a relatively large target. You don't need anything too big, but a decent sized target, you can get effective hits at 50 yards, 100 yards pretty easily. Maybe 150 yards if you've got a decent gun, you've got a decent shot, and you kind of know where the bullet is going to be at different ranges. But you can definitely extend the range quite a good bit by putting it in a rifle. And so you get the cowboys carrying around a little scabbard on the backside that would usually have a lever action gun in there. Wasn't too terribly heavy, wasn't something that they would walk around with, it stay in the scabbard most of the time, but just something to have out there in case the opportunity presented itself that you could get something and it would be accurate enough you could actually get it, not miss, and actually have your fresh meat. It was a cool concept. We've already got the ammunition because I have it in the revolver already, but it's a little bit far away for a revolver shot, so grab the lever action and take care of it. It was the idea of ammo interchangeability that made these guns fairly popular early on. Whatever I use in my revolver, I can use in the long gun, and the long gun is technically a long gun, but it's not so big, not so bulky that it gets in the way, still relatively light and compact, at least for its day, compared to other gun systems that would be out there. Proved to be fairly effective, and even at the time, this is around the mid to late 1800s, even at the time the government actually was very interested in these kinds of guns, and some of the government's guns at the time were actually lever action guns that were basically pistol caliber guns. They were relatively small and compact, they were effective enough for the job, and they had ammo interchangeability with a lot of revolvers, so it just kind of simplified things overall, and it proved to be fairly advantageous. Now, we move forward into the early 20th century, and pistol caliber and rifle caliber development has gone even further by this point, and there's even more separation between the two. And even in terms of military development, there's a lot of distinction between the two. In the First World War, for example, pistols were pistols, rifles were rifles, and the two really didn't meet in a lot of regards. Very distinct weapon systems, very different power factors, configurations, all those kinds of things. The rifles, the true rifles, tended to be fairly big, relatively heavy, and also very powerful. They had a very large effective range on most of them. A lot of them were basically hunting rifles that had larger magazine capacity. And so you get basically 30-06 type guns being used on the battlefield. And yeah, it was effective if you hit anyone, that's true. But technically more power than most of the time you actually needed. And the ammunition was kind of heavy to lug around. And then on the other side of the spectrum, you would get handguns with handgun cartridges. And on the battlefield, they didn't really tend to get used all that much, and certainly not effectively. After World War I, people sat down, the different nations sat down, and they kind of assessed things. And of course, the American military did this as well. And they sat down and they assessed how things went. And their conclusion when it came to the conventional pistol caliber guns that were being used was not very favorable. In World War I and also in World War II, they issued the 1911, which is a fairly famous 45 semi-auto handgun. And the 45 semi-auto handgun is not a bad concept, and the 1911 is effective enough as a handgun. The problem, though, is that in combat situations, it just didn't prove to be overly useful. They went through and they tried to actually confirm how everything went, and they found out that there were exactly 0 confirmed kills in World War I that involved the 1911. 0. This doesn't mean that the 1911 didn't have a place and it didn't have any utility at all. It still at least serves a role as a backup weapon, if nothing else. But in terms of an offensive weapon of war, it just wasn't very conducive. And the main problem that they had is the effective range. Handguns in general, 45 or not, handguns in general of any decent caliber are not easy to use for the average person. And you're dealing with a mass war at the time. You're dealing with literally a world war. And when you have that dire of a situation, you wind up drafting people into the military. There's a lot of them that went voluntarily, of course, but just to make sure that you have the manpower that you need, you're going to have to impose a draft. And so a lot of the people that were coming into the military were not overly well trained in guns, and a lot of them that were trained with guns were usually with lawn guns. You know, worked out on the family farm or the family ranch, and scare away crows with the old shotgun. Go out hunting in deer season with a rifle. Those were the kinds of guns that if people were used to shooting at with any kind of regularity, those were the kinds that they were used to shooting regularly. Handguns in America and a lot of other nations of the world were not really deemed as offensive weapons. They were always deemed as defensive weapons, something that you would use in very close quarters, and frankly, something that wasn't considered overly enjoyable to shoot most of the time. And so the proficiency with them tended to be very low. And then when you're taking in a draft of fairly low proficiency people, and because you need soldiers immediately, you usually don't have a whole lot of time to train them. What it winds up resulting in is just really, really, really poor use of handguns. So the U.S. military is looking at this, and there are other nations that would come to the same conclusion. It's not like it was unique or a special revelation, but they're looking at this saying, we can't attribute a single wartime kill to a 1911. And there are reasons why we gave people the 1911. We gave certain people 1911s because we wanted them to have some kind of a weapon at their disposal, but we didn't feel that they needed to have an actual infantry rifle. People who basically had other jobs than being infantry, we still wanted them to be armed, but they have other jobs. These might be truck drivers who are ferrying supplies. These might be tank crews who are working with a tank, and their tank is their main weapon. And we really want them to use the tank more so than we would want them to use a handgun in the first place. These people have other jobs, a lot of times other weapons, a mortar crew, anything like that. We just want them to have something for backup. But what we've learned from World War I is that the 1911 probably isn't our best choice in most of those cases, because most people cannot hit anything with a 1911 once you get past 15 yards. It's next to impossible for a lot of people to get effective hits, especially under battlefield conditions. When you're being shot at, your competency, especially with handguns, tends to go way down. And so the U.S. military came up with a solution, and they actually developed a pistol caliber carbine to replace the 1911 for most soldiers. That doesn't mean that they stopped using the 1911. It still had some utility as a backup weapon. When all else fails, at least you'll have that. And so they didn't get rid of it completely. The 1911 did, in fact, go into World War II and was actually used for quite a long time after that. U.S. military tends to keep things around for quite a long time. Just look at the B-52 bomber. That is an old design. Look at the C-130 Harrier, but the C-130 Hercules. Old design, but we're still keeping it around because it works just fine and it does everything that we need it to. And there really isn't anything out there that could really replace it all that well. That also has something to do with it. But the U.S. military tends to keep things around for a long time, and that included the 1911, so it got issued as well, but with the understanding that that was your last-ditch backup. To fill the gap between last-ditch backup and infantry rifle, they came up with the M1 carbine. The M1 carbine fired what was essentially a pistol caliber round, the .30 caliber carbine round. It was designed specifically for that weapon system. Well, actually, the cartridge was developed first, technically, and then the weapon system around it. So it was essentially a pistol caliber cartridge put into a rifle. In its original guise, it was a semi-auto rifle. It wasn't full auto. That was very light. The M1 carbine and its various guises pretty much always came in under 5.5 pounds unloaded. Very light gun, especially for its time, compared to like an M1 Garand or anything like that. It was a lot of times much lighter, and the ammunition for it was also much lighter. And so if you're thinking of crews that, they have a primary weapon already, like a tank crew, you have the tank, don't necessarily need a normal rifle, because they already have a primary weapon of some other sort, or they're just not frontline men like truck drivers and things like that. But you want them to have something that if they ever do find themselves in a battle situation, they can be effective with it. The M1 carbine filled that gap. And there are certainly debates about how well it did or didn't do as a particular platform. There were issues with reliability and some things like that. But the concept behind it proved to be very sound. Something that was lightweight, something that could extend the effective range of a pistol round to, well, on paper at least, the maximum range was 300 yards. In practice, I don't think there was ever a single soldier that actually used it at 300 yards, but on paper it could go that far. In actual practice, it was usually more like 30 yards to 130 yards. And even after World War II, the U.S. military sat down and they did a study. Actually, I think it was technically conducted during World War II. But from World War II, they learned that the average engagement distance that their soldiers were actually engaging at was around 120 yards. And so the M1 carbine had a maximum range of 300 yards, was well within the ballpark of what soldiers were actually doing. A lot of times, these are fairly low-skill soldiers. These are people who have been drafted, have relatively minimal training on their weapons. They're going to wait until the enemy is close enough that they're sure that they can take the shot. And the average wound up being around 120 yards. And you don't need a super powerful cartridge to get out that far. And if you can use a less powerful cartridge to make a less heavy gun so that they can be more concerned with doing other things than lugging this heavy weight around all the time, it works. And so even though the M1 carbine kind of met with kind of mixed results, especially in terms of its reliability, on the whole, it did what the American military needed it to do, and that was to fill the gap between infantry rifle and last-ditch backup pull-your pistol. It filled the gap, and it filled the gap sufficiently well. And this is something that they were finding about pistol caliber carbines as a general whole, is that these were weapons that could fill the gap on a lot of these, in a lot of situations that they weren't really even thinking about before. For example, full auto fire is one of the cases where pistol caliber carbines shined real well early on. At the time, you have the military saying our infantry rifles need to be big and powerful, and like I said, 30-06 cartridge. The Russian version was the 7.62 by 54R, which also is a really big cartridge by comparison. And you take those and you make them full auto, there's no way that a single guy by himself, especially a relatively untrained guy, is really going to be able to control that weapon system very well. Those systems have quite a bit of recoil, and it's just not real practical. I mean, there were full auto versions of those weapons that wound up getting made. For example, there was the BAR, which was a full auto 30-06 gun, and in full auto it just wasn't controllable. It made a much better anti-aircraft gun than it did an anti-personnel gun, unfortunately. There were attempts that were made, but it's just not very effective. But you go down to a pistol caliber round, something that was designed to have relatively low recoil. That's the whole idea behind a pistol caliber round, is you put a relatively small powder charge behind a relatively big bullet. That bigger bullet helps it be effective in lieu of not having as much powder behind it. And that lower powder is there to help with recoil, because this is designed to be held out at arm's length. You're not shouldering it and those kinds of things. Something that was designed to have relatively low recoil in full auto turned out to be much more viable. So on the military side in World War I and even in World War II, you have things like the Thompson submachine gun. Thompson submachine gun was a really heavy beast of a gun, but it was a practical one-man full auto firing weapon system. Someone is very talkative. I'll get to them in a moment. But it was a practical full auto weapon system. And then shortly after the development of the Thompson, they lightened it up a bit and eventually got to the point where they had the M3 grease gun. But still basically the same concept. Pistol caliber rounds being fired full auto gave you something that was a little bit more effective on the battlefield than just a regular pistol. And because you could spray bullets, it was a lot of times, especially in very close quarters kinds of situations where the enemy was relatively close. Close quarter combat, as we know it today, going house to house and whatnot, wasn't quite the same in World War I and World War II. So close quarters there might be, like within 50 yards, whereas us, it's literally, our idea of close quarters is room to room. But still, at those ranges, and you're spraying bullets, it works, at least well enough. So you have, the semi-auto versions being as a fill-in for the 1911, basically. You have the full auto versions filling in for the rifles that you don't want to put in full auto because they're very hard to control, especially for a single person. And then another thing that they found out about these pistol caliber guns is that depending on how you make them, you can actually make them really cheap. The open bolt designs with that were blowback, they weren't overly great to deal with and not as reliable as they could be, but they were really cheap to produce. And this is something that we see with the British Sten gun. Not overly well known for its reliability, like at all. But what it was cheap. They could make Sten guns by the thousands, literally by the thousands, and they managed to arm a lot of people that they would not have been able to arm otherwise just because it was that much cheaper. And so that's what we see with the pistol caliber carbines in the early 20th century. These were things that in full auto were more controllable than the full-size rifles were. These were things that could be produced very cheaply, and then they had the advantage of being relatively light and still more effective than a handgun. And so for all of those reasons, the pistol caliber carbine came onto the world stage in a very big way. World War II was basically a proving ground for the concept behind the pistol caliber carbine. And when those kinds of issues were at play, they really shined, and they shined well. Now you fast forward from there, and they made some changes to rifle caliber guns that helped fill in the role with the pistol caliber guns, and that's basically where we get the intermediate cartridge guns like the AR-15, the AK-47, eventually the AK-74, guns that had smaller cartridges in them, but were still technically rifle cartridges. So the recoil impulse wasn't as bad, which means they were more controllable in full auto, so they didn't have to rely on the pistol caliber guns for full auto fire as much. Also, those are platforms that have been in production for a long time now, and because of that, the cost of them has been lowered greatly. And so whereas it used to be the case that pistol caliber guns were the way to go if you wanted something that was cheap, now AR-15s and AK variants can also be had pretty cheaply. In fact, it's very, very easy to get a pistol caliber gun and an AR variant, even on the civilian market, for very close to the same price. And yeah, there are technically differences here and there, but they're at least in the realm of being comparable. For example, this particular gun, the Strebog, when I bought it, I didn't have all the additions on it that I have now, but when I bought it, it was basically a $600 to $650 gun, and it's still pretty close to that. And then an AR, a decent AR, you can get in the $600 range. And so as far as the initial cost is concerned, they're very similar now. And so a lot of those differences that really made the submachine gun stand out to start off with at the beginning of the 20th century and even into the mid-20th century has really started to fade with the cost dropping on intermediate rifle cartridge and guns. But even today, even though these other guns have come down in price, and since they lowered the powder charge on them, made them into intermediate cartridges instead of full power rifle cartridges, made them more controllable for full auto fire, and, well, still technically more effective than a handgun as well. A lot of those differences that used to exist between them have largely been mitigated. But at the same time, what's weird about it is that the pistol caliber carbine hasn't died. In fact, if anything, especially on the civilian market, it's become more popular. But even in the law enforcement and military areas, they haven't died out as well. In fact, the U.S. military just officially adopted a submachine gun after not having one for a very long time. The last submachine gun that the military used in regular deployment was the M3 grease gun, and we kept it around for a long time because we kept everything around for a long time. But we finally stopped using it in the 1990s, like 93, 94 is when it was officially decommissioned. So a good long time, from World War II clear up into the 1990s. And then for the longest time, until fairly recently, I think, was it 2018 that we finally adopted our newest submachine gun? I think it's the SCW, the B&T SCW. But we finally got back into submachine guns. And like I said, on the world stage, we see a lot more submachine guns coming on the market. There's the CZ Scorpion that is very popular on the civilian market, but it's also popular in the law enforcement and government agency realm too. And then, of course, the Strebog is becoming a fairly popular gun, and this one is one that was designed for the Slovakian military. Kind of question that in some regards. Those of you guys who've seen my videos on this know that it's not as good as it could be. There are some issues with it. I think there's actually a really great basic idea there, but there's definitely some room for improvement as well. And I've talked about that in other videos, so I won't go into that here. But my major point is that the submachine gun, or subguns in general, pistol caliber guns in general, whether they be semi-auto or full auto, they're not going anywhere. In fact, if anything, they're becoming more popular. And so you have law enforcement, government agencies, militaries adopting these things where they used to not. Like I said, the U.S. military, for the longest time, did not have submachine guns for regular deployment. Yes, the special ops teams and things like that would have some submachine guns, but for regular deployment, they're basically non-existent. They would just issue various forms of the AR-15 platform to various people. But we got back into it. And so the question is, why? The differences between subguns and the intermediate rifle caliber guns in a lot of categories is pretty nil. So why is it that submachine guns are still popular among civilians and among militaries? They're not ever seen as a primary thing. If I have the option between, in a self-defensive situation and I happen to have an AR-15, they're ready to go, and I happen to have this thing, they're ready to go, yeah, I'm going to take the AR-15. It's more powerful, and provided they're set up similarly and have the same basic sighting idea and those kinds of things, yeah, I'm going to take the more powerful one, especially provided they have the same number of rounds in each one. Yeah, I'm going to take the more powerful gun. That's kind of a no-brainer. But there are still enough difference between the platforms that they won't go away. One difference is that, at least in its 9mm form, the pistol caliber carbine is technically cheaper to shoot than the intermediate caliber rifles are. So that is one advantage that they still possess. They have a lot of recreational utility. It is also true that in terms of size and weight, while a lot of the intermediate caliber rifles have really come down in size and weight, pistol caliber rifles or carbines or carbine-esque guns are still just a little bit lighter, a little bit more compact. For example, this particular one right here in its guise as it is right now, unloaded, is about 6 pounds. I have a little fish scale that I put it on. The fish scale isn't exact, but around 6 pounds unloaded. And when I put it in its stowable configuration to take with me on business trips and whatnot, it winds up being around 17 inches long. Now, can you get an intermediate caliber rifle gun down to that kind of size? Technically, yes. You'd really have to chop off the barrel on them, though, and you lose a lot of the effect. And so the difference in terms of performance starts to become pretty nil at that point. And there are intermediate cartridges out there that tend to do better with shorter barrels, like say the 300 Blackout, for example. But then, in those cases, the price difference between the rounds becomes really pronounced. 9mm guns you can shoot pretty cheaply, all things considered. If you're not picky about the ammo and what the ammo does to the gun, you can get, I've seen 9mm ammo for as cheap as 12.9 cents a round. Whereas 223 ammunition, the cheapest that I've seen it, has been about 19 cents a round. That's not super great ammo in either case, but there is still a very marked difference. And if you're talking about shooting thousands of rounds over the lifetime of the gun, those differences definitely add up. And so in the long term, even if a pistol caliber carbine happens to be the same cost as, say, an AR-15 or maybe even more, in the long run, just because of how much cheaper the ammo is, it will actually save you more money over the other. That's a very real difference still. Like I said, the size and weight is a very real difference. But the thing that interests me the most, that seems to interest a lot of people, is the ammo compatibility issue. That is kind of what got us into pistol caliber carbines in the first place. You have people who are carrying around revolvers, and they wanted a longer gun that could extend the range beyond what the revolver could do, but they didn't want to have to buy separate ammo for it, and they definitely didn't want to have to carry extra ammo for it. And so ammo compatibility kind of is what got us into pistol caliber carbines in the first place, and today it's still a very relevant issue. In my travel pack, in my travel case for my guns, I have one little square set aside for spare ammo. I can basically only fit one box of ammo in there. And so for me, it makes a whole lot of sense to have both of my guns, my long gun and my short gun, run off of one type of ammo, because that's all I have room for is one kind of ammo. Ammo compatibility for certain people in certain situations is still a very real issue. And as long as ammo compatibility is an issue, I don't think we're going to see pistol caliber carbines go away completely. Just that idea of being able to travel with a long gun and a short gun for the various needs that you might have them, but take with you a minimal amount of ammo that's going to be able to feed each one, really does make a lot of sense for some people in some situations. And yeah, the weight difference between pistol caliber carbines and the intermediate rifle calibers is becoming minimized. The prices are basically already outmatched. Okay, you can get a pistol caliber carbine for $400. You can get an AR-15 for around $400. I'm not saying that either one will necessarily be great, but you can get them for around the same price. So price rise as far as entry level is about the same. Sustained cost is definitely different if you're talking about 9mm versus .223. Now if you're talking like 45 caliber pistol caliber carbine versus .223, yeah, that's not going to be as great a comparison. In fact, in a lot of ways it's going to be fairly similar. But with the right choice of pistol caliber carbine versus your intermediate caliber rifle, you can get a pretty good savings as far as ammo costs are concerned. And like I said, size and weights, technically these are still a little bit lighter and smaller, but they're really kind of starting to close on that gap. I think the thing that is going to wind up keeping pistol caliber guns, pistol caliber carbines in particular around, is just the issue of magazine compatibility, not magazine, but ammo compatibility. Being able to run my sidearm and my long arm off of the same box of ammunition really is advantageous for some people. And as long as that's the case, I don't think they're ever going to completely go away. Now, as for how popular they've become in the modern age, I honestly can't really account for that because, like I said, cost-wise, they're about the same. Yeah, the sustained cost of these is a little bit lower. I don't know if it's enough lower to justify it. I mean, for recreational shooters, I can definitely see where they want this, and I would consider myself a recreational shooter, and that's one of the big reasons why I like pistol caliber carbines, is they are cheaper to shoot than the rifle counterparts a lot of times. But why other people that would not be in the recreational shooter category would want them, like I said, I think the main issue that will keep them around is going to be ammo compatibility. Being able to feed multiple guns out of the same box of ammo really is a good thing for a lot of people. But it has been really interesting to see, though, that these things have not gone away. If anything, they've become more popular. Is it just, saving costs on ammo? Is it just, the realization that we don't always need a rifle? Well, they were realizing that they didn't always need a rifle all the way back in World War II. That might have something to do with it. But like I said, with the costs being as similar as they are, and also the weights getting to be as similar as they are, for example, the guys over at InRange, Ian and I forget the other fellow's name, but they prove that you can get an AR-15 to be pretty light. I think their What Would Stoner Do project, Eugene Stoner was the guy who designed the AR-15, at least primarily. Technically it was a group effort, but so Eugene Stoner was the main guy responsible for it. And they did this thing called the What Would Stoner Do project, and their quest was to get the lightest AR they possibly could that would still be functional and operable. And what they were able to achieve with commercially available parts was a gun that weighed 5 pounds 3 ounces and still had a functional sighting system and all those kinds of things. It probably was a gun that didn't have the best endurance in the world, and certainly would not be one that I'd want to do full auto sustained fire through. But on a practical level, it was not a bad put together at all, at least as far as what I saw. Kind of expensive, because you're going with specialized lightweight parts specialized lightweight parts sometimes cost quite a bit. And so their build was well over $1,000. I think it might have been pretty close to $2,000, but certainly over $1,000, so it wasn't the cheapest thing in the world. But they proved that you can get the system on AR-15 pretty light, technically even lighter than this one. Like I said, this one's almost 6 pounds compared to 5 pounds 3 ounces. That's not a negligible difference. Size-wise, this one still beats it. This one you can definitely pack down quite a bit more than theirs could. But the differences are really becoming pretty minimal in the modern age, but these things still won't go away. I think part of it is the recreational side of things, where it's just fun to go out and shoot something that's relatively cheap to shoot. And as far as centerfire ammunition is concerned, 9mm is pretty cheap. But on the practical side of things, like I said, as long as ammo compatibility is any kind of an issue, I don't think these are ever going to completely go away. Just my observations and thoughts. Thank you all very much for watching. Bye-bye.